1. The house I grew up in and my parents' denial of its haunting is what got me into the paranormal. So many things happened as I was growing up that for the first years of my life that I can remember, I thought it was normal. Before I get into the activity, I should provide some backstory. My father told my mom long before they bought the house that something demonic was attached to him. He said one day while driving, he looked in the rear view to see what he could only describe as a demon sitting in the car with him. He to this day will not describe what he saw, but he told her at the time that he felt he had always been running from it. She firmly believes that he brought this entity into our house, and both her and I were targets of it. Growing up, even my friends knew my house was haunted. Numerous people I had over would witness doors opening and closing, and every single one of them would feel immensely uncomfortable in the basement. I remember me and my former best friend would tell my parents about a skeleton that lived in the basement. They would play this off as our imagination, until they also started becoming victims to whatever lived in our home. My mom would regularly experience sleep paralysis, which in and of itself can be debunked, but not when coupled with the almost absurd amount of poltergeist activity and my personal accounts of what would happen to me. Not long after her first night of sleep paralysis, the alarm clock she kept by her bed flew off the nightstand and slammed into the wall. I remember hearing a woman screaming at the bottom of our stairs one night, and neither of my parents heard it. I was fully awake, and to this day I get chills thinking about it. Once I sat next to an unplugged fan, and it turned on full blast. I would later learn as an adult that an old man had died in my parents' bedroom, which was a hotspot for this type of activity. Hearing footsteps upstairs while my friends and I were in the basement became so real and so routine, we called the police at least twice believing my house was being robbed. I saw an apparition of a little girl and a cat sitting at my kitchen table one day. I don't know how, but I somehow became instantly aware that the cat's name was Moonbeam. From that day forward, I regularly would feel the cat jump up in my bed and rest at my feet, and I would always feel at peace during these occurrences. Once while I was home alone, I felt a sharp sting, like I had been shot with a paintball, and one of my dog's bouncy balls bounced away from me. Something had actually thrown it full speed towards my head. Later that same night I was watching TV and it turned to white static, and a big black X was across the screen. I still believe it's plausible this was a cable glitch of some sort, but I've never experienced this again. My parents at this time refused to believe me, for my own protection. In reality, they were fully aware and were having their own experiences, but didn't want to scare me. In protest, I set up my webcam to take pictures every few seconds while I went to school, and while no one was home, it captured a large red human-shaped figure standing in the center of the room, facing the camera. Even then, they refused to acknowledge it. But to this day, they remember that incident. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, suddenly hyper-aware that someone was about to enter my bedroom. I would feel all the hair on my body stand on end, and hide under the covers until I felt this presence leave. This became a regular occurrence as I got older, as I became a teen and really started finding all of this fascinating. I bought ghost hunting equipment and started using an old version of today's ghost box. Clear as day in the basement, I heard a deep voice call me by my first and last name. I later caught an EVP in my bedroom of two female voices talking about me as if they were wondering if I could hear them. I had indeed heard these voices before, but couldn't place them. A lot of this probably sounds too intense to be true, and that's okay. But after reading some of your experiences, I feel this is the only place mine might be validated and appreciated. I still actively ghost hunt, and live very far from the house I grew up in. But I'll never forget it. 2. For as long as I can remember, I have had strange things happen around me. I'll list them as I can remember them. My first memory of being scared of a ghost would be at my grandmother's house. She had a lamp that would come on if you touched it, starting out dim and getting brighter with each tap before going off again. When I would be in that room, it would come on. I would ignore it, but sometimes it would rapidly go from off to dim, bright, brightest, to off over and over until I unplugged it. It would only do this if I was in the room. At my mom's house, I would hear pacing in my room along the wall directly across from my bed. At my dad's, when I would try to sleep, I could see shadows dancing along the wall. I lived with my grandma for a bit, and she thought I was there one day shuffling around the house in a robe, hunched over going to my room. She called out to me asking if I had period cramps, thinking that's why I wasn't at school, and walking weird. But when she walked into my room, no one was there. I had night terrors while living there, and one episode of sleep paralysis where something was in the closet staring at me. When I lived on my own, I would hear voices that I thought were my neighbors or my outside radio. One day I decided to investigate, only to see my neighbors weren't home and my radio was unplugged. My stuff would move around a lot, and I started to think I was crazy. I told a friend I was hearing voices and thought something was wrong with me. Not long after that, a friend moved in with me, and I didn't tell her about the voices. While we were sitting at the kitchen table one day, I heard them. I froze and considered asking if she had heard it, and decided not to. Then she said, "You hear them too, don't you?" At first I didn't mind them. It was a man and a woman, and mostly it was just them talking to each other. Eventually, they started yelling at each other some. Then it was screaming at each other. They moved stuff more often when they were mad, and we figured out quick if they were mad, we needed to leave. After my friend moved out, it was just me, and on the nights my boyfriend would stay over, he would hear them too, but choose to make excuses and try to explain it away as neighbors or my outside radio. He mocked me, yelling out, "If there are ghosts here, y'all shown yourselves." Immediately after, a picture frame came flying off the wall and hit the foot of my bed. Which reminds me, it was there when I moved into the house, with an old lady's picture in it and some white hair taped to it. Soon after this, my dog died. I came home one night and could hear her barking, which made me sad, because I knew she was dead. I ignored it and went in to hear the man and woman yelling, so I decided to leave. The light wouldn't come on, and suddenly it was silent. So I went to run for the door and got pushed. It was then that I realized my dog never barked unless she was scared. I honestly think she was warning me. After that night, I moved in with my boyfriend, but never lost the feeling of being watched and followed. After I had a baby, it got worse. Lots of banging in the house, my boyfriend, now husband, having fits of rage for no reason, and even a wooden door frame being ripped from the wall. One night I heard my husband from the living room yell out to me. I yelled out, "What?" Because I was trying to get our baby to sleep and he had woke him up. So I thought. He called out, "Who are you talking to?" After some confusion on both ends, he said he hadn't said a word. Not long after I hear, "Kristen?" from the living room. The baby was asleep, so I quietly answered yes. And in 0.2 seconds, he flew in there and laid next to me. After some persuading, he finally told me he thought I was standing in the doorway staring at him, and when I answered him, he could tell where I was from my voice, and that as soon as I answered, the figure in the door shot into the room with me. Things like this have always happened to me, and I got heavily involved with my church from the fear of it. Things were increasingly getting worse and more scary. Lately my kids have been sick back to back, and we haven't been going. I went from having almost no bad experiences to my bedroom door being pushed open night before last, with a set of hazy fingers gripping the door. I have tried ignoring them, I have tried asking them to leave, praying them away, talking to people about it, staying silent about it, you name it. I don't know what to do. There are so many more things that have happened, but I can't list them all, as this post is already too long. And to top it off, everyone thinks it's in my head except for my dad and husband. As I was typing all this out, I've gotten chills and a gust of cold on my neck. I have noticed when I talk about them, it gets worse. But I thought typing wouldn't matter. I was wrong. It really sucks because I know it's real, but when I talk about it, people think I'm insane. My dad only believes me because I never cry, and when I was telling him about it, I was crying my eyes out, and he got chills and thought someone was behind him, with only me and him in the house. Edit, because I forgot this one. My husband has night terrors pretty often, and I usually wake up to him whining or grunting in his sleep and wake him up. Once, though, he was actually crying very quietly in his sleep. I tried to wake him up and couldn't, so I just held him close to me and told him I had him and that I was there. He wakes up and pulls away from me, looking around wildly. I asked him what he was dreaming, and he refused to tell me until the morning. Turns out he was awake and having sleep paralysis. His dreams started out as he had looked at me and said I was staring at him with hollow eyes, and that I said, "The Dark One is coming." And his eyes snapped open and he saw a dark figure hovering over him, inches from his face. He has seen this same entity before, and said it was the one in the doorway with me the night he thought I was staring at him. He also saw it once before when he was literally dying from salmonella as a child. It was standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him while angels surrounded him and protected him. He had fever so severe it burned his skin, and he has permanent pigment damage in the hair on his face and neck. He refuses to admit it's all real, and says it was a fever. 3. Let me start off by saying that I do not, to my knowledge, possess any powers or abilities. However, my daughters and I share a very strong connection, and can often feel each other's energies. I might also add here that both my daughters and myself had also had childhoods that are peppered with weird paranormal activity, but nothing rare or special. It's pretty obvious they share my sensitivity. Over the last maybe 3 to 4 years, I have been on my own personal spiritual journey, and have noticed my connection with people's energies has heightened, and have been told by close friends and family they have felt or sensed me when I have thought very hard about them. I of course do not say that to them, because it's almost always just an accident. Anyway, with this strengthening sensitivity, I have had increased run-ins with this unidentified energy that seems to be attached to me. The first encounter was when I was half asleep. I wasn't planning to sleep. It was randomly in the middle of the day and I just kind of got drowsy, but I was fighting to stay awake. My boyfriend at the time popped into my head, and I thought I must have been dreaming him there, and I reached out to ask him not to leave. That's when I realized I was actually sitting up, as if asking someone to stay. I shrugged it off, and just figured I was sleep-talking to myself, and closed my eyes to focus on waking up. I do not know why I was so overcome with this need to fall asleep. I was holding on to something solid though, although nothing was there. Like an arm or something. I was not asleep at all, and could see inside my room, which was flooded with sunlight. But I felt like I took a sleeping pill. Whatever it was, I could hear it sigh and grunt at me, like an annoyed boyfriend, and I instantly knew it was going to do what I wanted. Now let me clear one thing up. I thought I had just been thinking too hard about my boyfriend just before a power nap, and had somehow felt his energy. I do not tap into energies during the daytime because it causes the other person to feel annoyed and not know why. Also, it's rude and violates them, but it's not like I can help thinking about my boyfriend. It's not my fault I think too hard. This is the only reason I was not alarmed. I just thought, oh crap, he's probably working, and here I am turning into the irritating feeling in the back of his mind and he doesn't know why. I physically felt this heavy body like nothing lay down beside me, as if to simply get me to knock it off and stop trying to focus on waking up. I laid down next to it, and it literally felt like he was there, but nothing was there. I hugged it to try and trigger my brain to concentrate on reality, and something solid, and not drift off to a dream, and it pushed me off very, very hard. I felt a painful burst of energy almost surge through my chest and drip away from me. I sat up, gasping for air as if I had the wind knocked out of me, and fully stood up. The second encounter, I was once again between awake and asleep, and I am starting to wake up to use the bathroom. I hear a man's voice say, "Hey," almost like you would say to someone you've been trying to wake up. And when they finally do, you're like, well, hey there. I of course shot my eyes open to see just an eye looking at me. I was 100% awake, and this wasn't just a floating eye, but it appeared as though the rest of the face was cloaked, or wasn't materializing or something. It had a heavy brow and didn't look attractive. I could only see like the Phantom of the Opera mask portion of its face. And no, it was not my boyfriend's face. We don't even live together, I live with my kids. I forgot all about the bathroom and just rolled over hoping it would leave. Third, I was needing to wake up early for something very important and ignored my alarm. I was awoken by a man's voice who sounded exactly like my older brother who lives in Florida. He just kind of shouted my name, but in a way my brother used to do to wake me up if I was going to be late for school. Like urgent but gentle. I shut up, thinking someone was in my house. I live in a small town, and we rarely lock our doors, and oftentimes random relatives will do that knock and enter thing when they come over. So I thought my uncle or someone was calling my name to get my attention. Nope. I was as alone as I was when I went to bed. Not even my daughters were home that night. Lastly, we moved out of that house. I have been in this new place for months with no unusual happenings. I no longer have the same boyfriend, and am getting pretty close with a friend of mine. One night I just said goodnight to him on the phone before bed, and of course he was on my mind. That night, I was slightly and very, very gently nudged awake by what felt like someone in my bed. I turned over and was wrapped in a loving embrace, like a friend or lover had returned or something. It was not sexual or scary. It was like you would hold someone who had just had a bad dream, and you were comforting them. My brain tried to think and pull myself awake, but I just laid on what seemed like his chest and fell back asleep. Does anyone know what this is? Is something attached to me? 4. I was reminded of this the other day. Thought it was worth posting my experience here for opinions. Pretty sure there is some rational explanation for this encounter, but would be interested in any opinions, similar encounters, and theories. It's going to be long, so to be a bit backward, I'll kick off with the too long didn't read. It's a variant on what I've recently discovered is called the black-eyed kids phenomena. Bit of scene setting. In 1996, or 1997, I lived in a fairly old terraced house with a cemetery at the end of the road. Cliché, I know, but it's an important detail. Nothing remarkable about the house or area. It was just convenient for college. Anyway, I was up late one night on the PC in my bedroom, which looked out onto the street. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. For whatever reason, probably to give my eyes a rest, I wandered over to the window and looked down the road in the direction of the cemetery, although it was too far down the street for me to see. I saw 3 people walking slowly down the road. I could see that they were quite old and appeared to be dressed in funeral clothes, which given the hour was weird. There were 2 women and a man. I'd put their ages at about 80, and the woman in the middle was being steadied and guided by the other woman and the man. As they came closer, I got the impression she was upset. My first thought was that given their age, she had recently buried her husband, and grief had caused her to behave slightly irrationally, causing her to try to be out near the cemetery at that hour, and that the other 2 were friends or relatives trying to look after her and get her home. Anyway, it was all interesting enough for me to carry on watching as they got closer to the house. Just outside the front of the house was a street lamp. I watched them as they made their way past, but when they got to the lamppost, they all stopped, and the upset woman in the middle looked up at me and grinned. This was when things got weird. The grin became a sort of grimace, and if there was any color in her face to start with, it was now dead white. At that point I realized I was staring right into her eyes, but her eyes were pitch black. Time sort of dilated. If you've ever crashed a car, the final split second before you make impact seems to drag out as you process more information than normal in the time frame. It was that sort of thing. I'm sure we only made eye contact for a split second, but it felt like several minutes as my peripheral vision faded, and I felt like all I could see was these 2 black holes in her face, drawing me in. Although the distance between us didn't change, she somehow felt like she was coming closer, and I was kind of aware, although I couldn't honestly say I could see them at that point, that the 2 people with her were just continuing to look down the road as if frozen, but waiting for this woman to finish whatever she was doing. I was suddenly hit with this intense feeling of dread and panic, so I threw myself on the floor. As soon as I'd broken her gaze, I felt pretty stupid that this upset old woman who clearly needed help had spooked me so badly. So I looked out the window again, and there was no sign of them. It was a longish straight road, and the house was towards the middle, so Linford Christie would have had trouble getting out of sight in the time I looked away, let alone 3 octogenarians. So, any ideas what this was all about? Tired mind playing tricks? It felt far too real for that. And all these years later I can still remember every detail incredibly clearly, and I can recall a good amount of the dread I felt staring into those eyes. I get chills just retelling the story. 5. I was considered an oddity among children. Gifted was the term thrown around often. I couldn't get along with most children because I found them to be profoundly stupid and unpleasantly noisy. They in turn found me weird, and weren't shy about vocalizing it. I was a very still, calm child. I was often told that speaking to me was like speaking to a small adult. Something nobody ever understood was that I often just happened to know how things will turn out. It's difficult to explain beyond very good intuition. It's fairly common now, but back then it was more sporadic. Still, this sense of what was to come is almost never wrong. My mother and I lived in a low-income apartment complex at the edge of town. She recently begun dating a man named Jerry. My mother had invited him over one night and put me to bed. I couldn't hear them in her room, and nobody had shared the talk with me, but somehow I just knew they were having sex, and the basics of what that entailed. I was only 6 at this time. You see, I bring it up because this is where everything changed. I couldn't sleep. I wasn't afraid of the dark like most children, and I didn't believe in monsters in the closet or under the bed. I just lay in my bed, bored out of my mind. There was a window across my small room near the head of my bed. A yellow streetlight was out there, allowing me to see my room fairly well. There was also a tree, which had a branch always hanging in view. I focused on the tree as a desperate attempt at amusement. After all, I couldn't disobey my mother and leave the bed. Something strange happened. While there was the branch bare from autumn, something else was coming into view. At first, I didn't know what to make of it, and brushed it off as my imagination. It seemed like the shadow of a large spider's limbs, easily mistaken as the branch in the beginning. Then I realized it didn't align. This object, moving these spidery legs slowly into view, was coming from below the window, while the branch hung from above. It wasn't long before I realized it was a hand with long fingers like claws. There was a mass that the hand connected to, but it was too large to fit entirely in the window. It tapped on the glass. That was enough to send me screaming out of my room. My mom's room was across the hall. I pounded on the door, looking back at the window. The shadow was still there, tapping patiently. I could feel it staring at me, somehow knowing exactly where I was and wanting me to come back. I called to my mother, pleading for her to let me in. She just told me to go to bed, completely oblivious to how odd it was that I would behave this way. So I tried to play the innocent child card, asking what she was so busy doing. She just got angry. I shut my eyes, sobbing uncontrollably, balled up in the corner of the hallway. I was too terrified to go back to bed. I don't remember anything after that. My mother eventually married Jerry. They got a house together in a nice neighborhood. There were a few kids that could bear my company now that I was a little older. However, since that night with the thing in the window, I'd been having nightmares. They were so terrible I had to learn lucid dreaming. Of course, this being in the days before the internet or widespread popularity of the occult, I didn't know it had a name and I had to learn it myself out of necessity. With control over my dreams, I was able to minimize the nightmares, but I could never fully get rid of them. It was like taking shelter in a house while a horrible storm persisted outside. I knew it was there, but I tried to ignore it. Something was different when we moved into that house. My room was just beneath the roof, giving it a weird shape according to the roof's design. Because of this large pyramid-like corner cutting into my room, there was always this dark spot. In fact, there was a small light bulb with a tassel in that corner. That was how dark it was, no matter how bright the day happened to be. That corner frightened me at night, like there was something sitting in it, watching me. It was so black at night, it almost appeared to be a wall. I felt like the only thing saving me was the window between my bed and that corner. I'd often wake up thirsty or desperate for the bathroom. I never dared to move. We had gotten a dog a short time later, and even it avoided that corner of the room. In fact, it would often lie in bed with me, if not between myself and that corner. This fear was made worse by the fact that Jerry didn't like me. I was often confined to my bedroom because it was too difficult to share space with him. That corner remained an irrational fear for the 3 years we lived there. I didn't realize it, but down the line this would seem comforting by comparison. You see, years later my mother divorced Jerry. He had spent all of her money, leaving her bankrupt. We had to move in with my grandparents. They were very pious, to the point that my grandmother had wanted to be a nun as a girl. She'd even had hopes of me becoming a priest. Crosses and the like were everywhere in the house. I mention this because of so many movies and novels using Christianity in some form as a shield. I'm telling you right now it didn't work. By this point, I'd hit 14 years of age. Computers had just gotten their own classes in school now, and dial-up internet had just come out. Japanese cartoons were starting to get more popular in the US. My grandmother's house was a single floor and a basement. It wasn't anywhere near as scary as the basement of Jerry's house. His had uneven floors and seemed like someone just threw paint over dirt. My grandmother's basement had furniture, a second bathroom, and even mock wooden paneling. A carpet was put in at some point before we lived there. Unfortunately, I no longer felt protected by my dog, as my grandparents didn't want her anywhere in the house. She was given away, and I was left to face this fear alone. Remember that strange feeling I had at Jerry's? It changed. In fact, it disappeared, only to be replaced by something much worse. At night, when everyone was asleep, I could hear footsteps going up and down the hall. My grandparents would go to bed late on occasion, but this always occurred after they'd retired for the night. The kitchen light was always on in case someone needed to get up, so anyone looking out their door could see. One night, I decided to see who it was. I gathered all the courage I could and stayed low in my bed. My room was small, so the door was right there at the foot of my bed. I turned the knob so quietly you'd never notice if you weren't really looking. The door had a habit of creaking, so I only cracked it. There was nobody making the footsteps, yet there I was, hearing them. Everyone in the house slept with their doors shut, so they were all accounted for. I shut the door quietly, not wanting to attract any attention, and pulled the blankets over my head. I was horrified when the footsteps stopped in front of my door. Now, there was a crawl space outside my door in the ceiling. I made the assumption that the thing stayed there, and the footsteps always began and ended there. My grandparents eventually moved in with my great-grandfather, leaving their house for my mom. By this point, the nightmares were so bad that I developed insomnia. It wasn't very helpful with the pacing in the hallway. We got a computer, and dial-up internet had long been replaced with something else. I think it was DSL, but I'm not sure. Anyway, wireless connection hadn't happened yet. With the newfound space in the house, I'd gained my mom's old bedroom as a place to sleep, while my old room became my entertainment area. This room shared a wall with my old one. I thought moving away from the crawl space would ease my nights, but I was wrong. My nightmares intensified, and I began seeing what I refer to as hallucinations. But in all honesty, I don't believe they were. There was a night that I lay there, bored much like that first night when everything started. The room was dimly lit by my alarm clock. I was dreading another day at school. My grades had dropped significantly, and every teacher was after me about it. I can't say I blame them. I'd even been seeing a few counselors and therapists. A few of them refused to see me after a couple sessions. It frightened me to think that my mind, my experiences, were too much for a professional to handle. As I lay there counting the seconds, I grew uncomfortable and decided to change my position. I rolled from my side onto my back, only to be frozen in terror. There was a young man lying on back on the ceiling, looking down at me. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. Another me, locking eyes with a smile. I looked around at myself in panic. I was on the bed with the clock beside me. I looked back up at the other me, who was lying like he was crucified. He laughed, but there was no sound. He fell on me, causing me to thrash about from fear. He was nowhere to be found, but from there on I saw a face in my wooden closet door, screaming. At first I told myself that it was my imagination. I was proven wrong when one of my friends pointed it out all on his own. Another one refused to go in there, claiming the room made him feel weird. When I turned 18, I'd spoken to my cousin Nick about these incidents, as we'd been inseparable all those years. He was a large man with a shaved head, having taken up the hobby of weightlifting in his basement. I figured he'd be the only one to believe me, as the family had, for some reason, performed an exorcism on him when he was only 2 years old. He confessed to occasionally seeing things at my great-grandfather's house, where he lived. When he tried to tell someone, they claimed it was our great-grandmother watching over him. It's funny how that works. There was a water drainage tunnel across from our high school, which was built next to a golf course, if you can believe that. Its mouth was on the side of a small, steep hill that led into a river. Kids typically went there to skip class. I had a birthday in early autumn, often making me the oldest in my class. He hadn't graduated yet and decided to skip with me to the tunnel. We walked down it, unafraid, as the only people we would encounter were other kids. That day, though, we didn't get too far in. Instead, we saw something. You need to understand that seeing things was never truly my gift. It was his. We both stopped in our tracks. I saw a human leg. At first, I thought someone had been hurt by a vagrant. But we didn't really have those in our town. Besides, it was pale, almost translucent, and it was upright, as if it were standing. Unsure of what I was seeing, I asked Nick if he saw what I saw. He simply replied, "Yeah." We ran. This led to a very different way of life for us. You see, we used to have sleepovers every weekend when I was a kid. Because of our shared experiences, neither of us could sleep, so we'd often leave the house for a long walk. These walks continued even after the sleepovers stopped. We visited the golf course next to our old school after graduation. It was quiet, decently lit, and peaceful. However, one night we saw a figure made of light standing behind a tree. Nick had pointed it out to me, asking if I saw anything. When my story matched his, we decided to try calming ourselves by proving it was an illusion. We went around either side of the tree. It backed away from him and came closer to me. I ran. Another night, we'd walked behind this strip mall near my house. Nick had to pee, so I walked a little ahead, mildly impatient. The parking lot was very well lit, and it was late, so we were the only ones out. As far as other people were concerned, it was pretty rare that we see anything other than the occasional car on our walks. I paced about, waiting for Nick when I heard him say something. I walked back, calling to him. "What? I didn't hear you." He came out from behind the dumpster he'd been urinating behind. His eyes were wide. "Wait, where were you just now?" I pointed off a good 30 feet or so. He grabbed me and hurried away from where we were, looking back from time to time. Once we were across the parking lot and crossing the street, he finally told me what happened. Apparently, he was behind the dumpster. He saw a shadow on the building moving like it was creeping up on somebody. Since a parking lot light was behind him, he thought it was me. It couldn't have been someone else, as there was nowhere for anyone to sneak up on us. He thought it was me and jokingly said he saw me. That was when he heard me calling back to him from a distance. That shadow wasn't mine, and there was nobody else in the area. I looked up haunted locations in our town after that. The strip mall was one of the locations reported to have numerous sightings of a shadow moving along the walls of the stores, and items falling for no reason. We shared our stories with my friends Natalia and Javier. They were interested in ghost hunting with us. Natalia was a tomboy of Puerto Rican descent. She had her share of trauma in life, both at the hands of friends and, sad to say, family. She was studying Wicca at the time and had many of her own encounters, such as ghostly images regularly appearing in photographs. Javier was a short Mexican man. He was a Catholic, but was also only a thrill-seeker. He never had any real experiences like the rest of us. This balanced us out very well, since Nick somehow managed to claim himself as an atheist. Thinking back, I'm pretty sure that's some bizarre method of comforting himself. I was an agnostic, so I felt like we might accomplish something. I think I was just glad to have a group of people to share this with. It felt like I could finally stand up and confront whatever it was that was harassing me. It didn't quite work out that way. You see, it wasn't until a while later that I learned how it works. If you notice them, they notice you. And if you fear them, they will hunt you. Our most noteworthy trip as a team was into the tunnel, because the small cemetery it stretched under was on the haunted location list. This cemetery was at the very end of the golf course and on the side of a steep riverbank. We had to be very careful getting in and out. We went 3 hours into that tunnel before something happened. We started hearing voices coming from deeper in the tunnel. Everyone froze. I explained that it could be noise from above ground, as we occasionally passed a manhole cover. We shut off our flashlights to avoid any tricks of the light, and I whistled a bit of that generic circus song. We waited, hearing the echo travel. After a moment of silence, a completely different whistle answered back. That was enough for me, but the others reluctantly pushed us to go on. Anyone who's done urban exploration can attest to the strange environment of a water drainage tunnel. Ladders to the manhole covers were often rusted or covered in minerals from years of rainwater pouring over them. Small soft stalactites hung from the ceiling. One got Javier in the face, forcing him to clean it off. He said it tasted gross and salty. Sometimes there was a branch-off point, or a sort of waterfall. I wish I knew where all this water was coming from when it wasn't raining above ground. We reached a point where we could see a sharp left turn in the distance. Our lights picked up movement, but then it could have been another trick of the light. We kept moving forward until we finally noticed that there was something to it. We were probably 50 feet away. It's hard to know for sure. There was a woman in a flowing gown of some kind, pacing back and forth from that left turn. Her gown was bloodied, or at least it appeared to be. Rather than continue on, we decided to turn back before she noticed us. I warned the others that as we left we needed to remain calm and not call attention to ourselves. They agreed. With that, I also warned them that if anyone calls to run, we do it, no questions asked. I was very angry when Nick was the first to turn back. Javier followed him close, but Natalia was kind enough to stay near me, even though she and the others voted me in the back. You see, the tunnel was small enough that we could pass one another with some effort, but had to walk single file. I got the familiar feeling of something watching me, waiting. I stopped moving and asked Natalia to look over my shoulder, frightened that if I simply did it myself, it would somehow yield worse results. She looked. "Nothing, you're good." We continued on for a bit until I felt a cold hand press down on my shoulder. I quietly called Natalia's name, only for the hand to shove me forward violently. I screamed for us to run and heard Nick scream, as much as a baritone can scream. Javier shouted for him to wait, and Natalia looked back at me with horror. I was struggling to get back on my feet, but I was being shoved down again from 3 directions. Natalia was so brave. She reached out for me and kept with me during our escape, despite the fact that, as she later put it, I was being tossed around like a rag doll. We reached the entrance to the tunnel only to find that Nick was stuck at the mouth. Javier made it out, but Nick was too big and panicked to summon the finesse required for climbing out. Natalia and I passed him, practically shoving him to the side. We made it out, and saw him look back into the tunnel. Whatever he saw, it made him frantic enough to risk falling into the river. We all rushed to my car and drove off. He never told us what he saw, but once we all calmed down, I noticed something. I had a cross perfectly cut into the flesh at the base of where my thumb met my palm. It was like my skin simply split open, and it was too perfect to be a simple scrape during the commotion. While the inside of the cut was bloody, it didn't spill over the wound either. It stayed perfectly within its boundaries. After that incident, we stopped doing our ghost hunting. For whatever reason, the four of us together always stirred up the most undesirable things. We had a whole group for night walks, though. I remember Natalia and Javier decided to stay at my house for the night once, while Nick went home. By this point, I had a couch and a spare mattress in the basement. They decided to stay there and watch movies while I went to bed. The next morning, I found Natalia with her head buried between the couch cushion and its back. Javier had his head under the pillow and the blanket pulled over. They told me that they didn't want to stay in the basement again. Apparently sometime during the night, they'd seen a cloaked figure wearing a hood over its head. It was standing just beyond the doorway to the laundry room, where the lights didn't reach. Both of them not only saw it, but saw it move its head, like it was looking back and forth at each of them. For some reason, while its presence was clear to them, it wouldn't advance into the light. That night I was walking with Nick to a park. It was a beautiful place with an open field used for soccer. Strangely this time, as we walked across the street to it, there was an odd sensation. It was like there was a wall, a barrier that I had to push through to get past a certain point where the ground changed. Nick described it like a change of air pressure. I tried to brush it off as nothing, worried about calling too much attention to it, just in case. It was fine up to a point. Nick was just a little ahead of me, as I had to catch my breath. Once I did, I followed behind him. Suddenly he called out to run and hurried past me, but I saw nothing. I turned to follow him, but felt a pair of strong, bony hands clamp down around my neck. There was nobody there, but I was choking. I couldn't breathe. I tried to run, but the lack of breath made my muscles and lungs burn. Nick had abandoned me, already across the street at his truck. I was getting dizzy, but I managed to push through that strange barrier again. Once I did, those hands vanished like they were never there. I was angry at Nick, even though I could understand it. He said that he'd seen someone in a black cloak coming at us. They were running straight for us, and he didn't want to wait. You can imagine how this made me feel. In our efforts to confront whatever it was that had haunted me, we only succeeded in making it more aggressive. I conceded defeat, and decided to shove it all in the back of my mind, bury it, so it was no longer a part of me. We stopped our night walks for a while. We'd hoped that might help reduce the number of incidents. Of course, Nick didn't have to worry about his house like I did. After a couple weeks, we went for our walks again. Nothing happened, so our confidence grew. It was almost as if nothing had ever happened. We came near the old golf course. I stopped him, not wanting to go through the area. We'd seen so much there already. The disembodied leg, the pacing woman, the moonlight man. I didn't want to see anything else. He was being arrogant again, as he'd grown to be over time. He conceded to my objection, but instead insisted on going through the graveyard the tunnel stretched under. I didn't feel comfortable being alone, since the golf course was at the edge of the ghetto, and bored cops often patrolled the area. We'd already been harassed several times over the years by them. On top of that, it was late autumn, so I had to keep moving to stay warm. We paced through the graveyard. It was honestly quite dull. There was no activity whatsoever. It was really dead. Still, I was relieved to leave the graveyard without incident. We neared the exit. It was a bit odd, having only a single stone bridge providing the way out. The bridge had a staircase connected to its side, leading down to a small pond. We just reached the bridge when a squad car turned in. We rushed down the steps, hoping the driver didn't see us. After all, he had his searchlight on, and would be focused on the areas it lit. We moved away from the base of the steps and pressed ourselves up against the bridge. The car stopped at the center of the bridge and turned its light out into the graveyard. We didn't want to be caught, as we were technically trespassing, even though the gates were open. It wasn't long before a second car pulled up beside the first. The searchlight shut off, but they remained on the bridge. We couldn't see what they were doing, just their headlights. That was when I noticed something horrifying. There was a young tree several feet away from us, just large enough to be climbed. It still had leaves on it, unlike most of the other trees in the area. A pair of yellow eyes was staring at us. I nudged Nick with my elbow, unable to speak. He looked on and let out a gasp. I think he wanted to scream but caught himself. The creature climbed down the tree head first, like a lizard. Its shape was identical to that of a large dog or wolf. It was completely black. Now when I say that, I don't mean its fur. I mean that the moon was full, and there were almost no clouds in the sky, yet something was off. This wolf's fur didn't have any shine. It was like a silhouette or a shadow. It crept towards us with its head low and its movements deliberate. There were dry leaves everywhere, blanketing the grass. When we ran down the bridge, we made a pretty good amount of noise, yet this thing made absolutely none. The cold, stiff grass didn't crunch, and neither did the leaves. It came close, so close that it could have bitten me. It barely spared a glance at Nick, keeping its focus on me. It didn't even take notice of the police cars above us. It paced back around the tree it came from. It was utterly unafraid, even showing its back to us. Finally, it went over to the pond, which was to our left. We watched it sink down into the black water. The disturbing thing about this was that the moon's reflection never became disturbed by ripples. The wolf never came back up either. We were stuck there a while longer before the police left. We hurried back to our homes after that. When I turned 20, my mom kicked me out of the house. She had done this before, always over little things like a single dirty plate being out. She wasn't a well person, and hadn't been for a long time. She'd always call me back to her house whenever she got lonely. This time, though, I stayed with my grandparents. My great-grandfather had died, so his house was theirs now. I stayed in the basement with my own TV and bathroom. It wasn't nearly as frightening as most basements, aside from that damned crucified Jesus statue in the corner. It had been a long time without incident. I was grateful for that, and nearly forgotten about it all. Then there was this one night. I shut off all the lights and tucked myself in. You need to understand, the stairs that led to the basement always creaked. Nobody could go down them without making a lot of noise. There was nothing, absolutely nothing to alert me that someone was in the basement, either before or after. I thought I heard something, but being a basement with a water heater, I thought nothing of it. Shuffling occurred nearby, but nobody would go down there without turning on the light. There wasn't any way to see. It was completely black. The shuffling grew closer until something smashed. There was a great commotion of things being toppled. The clothing that hung on the rack made noise like it fell over. Next, my collectible figurines beside the bed fell over loudly. My grandmother's statues toppled to the floor. And oddly enough, it wasn't random. It happened in a circle, starting at the left foot of my bed, to the right, directly next to me. I clenched my eyes shut, petrified and shaking violently. The noise stopped, only for a hand to very slowly press down on the bed, right beside my head. It pushed down more and more, feeling like it was someone incredibly heavy. I felt their face just above mine, breathing on me, studying me, waiting for me to open my eyes. I don't know how long I was trapped there like that, but even after it left, I couldn't move. I eventually passed out. When I woke up the next morning, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. There's been nothing since then. I'm nearing my 30s now and in a great relationship. My friends all went their own ways and I moved out of state. My girlfriend confided in me that when she was younger, she too was labeled as gifted. She also lost sleep, but more than anything else she confessed that she used to see what she referred to as shadow demons. They would always linger in the corners of her house, congregating in her room. She had to ignore them, as I had done years ago, or they would become far more frightening. We live fairly boring lives now, but every now and then something odd will happen. I'll hear a voice as plain as day right in my ear when I'm alone, or maybe I'll hear footsteps when my girlfriend is asleep. From time to time, I'll even feel like I'm being watched. Always from the same location in the apartment. Over the last decade, I've moved at least once per year, and this sensation always occurred for some varying period of time. Most recently, I've moved across country to Washington State, and about a month ago I was up late. Something started scratching at the glass sliding door in my balcony. I didn't dare open the blinds. My balcony has absolutely no access unless you have a ladder. It was slow and purposeful. I only heard it the one night, and nothing has happened since. Still, I'll continue to ignore such things as I have been, but in the back of my mind I'll always wonder, what is it waiting for? What does it want? I hope to whatever gods there may be, that this time my guess is wrong. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 72. Thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed this one, because it turned out a lot longer than I was expecting it to. But I had some good stories, some of which had been sitting there for a while, so I didn't want to keep them waiting any longer. I'm just going to keep the rest of the outro quite short because I think I've been bending your ears for long enough. We will have TIFUs tomorrow. That'll be a Saturday. And I haven't decided on anything for Sunday yet, but I do have some options to pick from. So we'll see what I come up with then. And with that, I think I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.